Hello, I'm Kyla and welcome back to the Infinite Library. So it is now 2024 and I have to do my wrap up for December. So I had a bit of a mixed reading month, I'd say. So I read 14 books in the month of December, which is 3 more than I read in November, as I only had 11 then. But of those 14 books that I read, I did have 2 DNFs. And I read a lot of shorter books, and I read a lot of books in like varied genres that isn't necessarily always the books that I would pick up to read. So I had a very mixed reading month, I'd say. I don't think I really ended the year with a bang, but I did manage to get some interesting books in my month off. I was off for the month of December, so I managed to get a decent amount of reading done, but I wasn't really in the mood for anything too heavy. So I did 14 books. In total, I read 3,573 pages, and all of those 14 books were physically read. I didn't read any of them via ebook. I did have one of them as an ebook, which was an ARC that I'd received, but then literally as I was about to start the ebook, a physical copy of it arrived at my door. So I ended up just reading it physically instead, because that is kind of how I prefer to read things. So genre-wise, of the 14 books that I read, 4 of them were fantasy, 3 were contemporary, 2 were graphic novels, 2 were mystery books, 2 were historical, and I read a poetry book, which you don't see very often on this channel because I'm not really a massive fan of poetry. But this was one that I happened to pick up whilst I was away. And it's one I've kind of had my eye on for a while, and it seemed like my kind of thing. So for once, there is a poetry in this wrap-up. Sources: 5 of the books were borrowed from people, 5 of them were from the library, 1 I was sent, which was the ARC, 2 I bought, and 1 was a reread. And ratings-wise, it wasn't the worst. I had no 1 or 2 stars. I had 8 free stars, so you can kind of see how it's a bit of a mid-reading month for me. I had 3 4 stars and 1 5 star, which was a predictable 5 star for me, so it wasn't a surprise that the book that I rated a 5 star was a 5 star. And that rounds up to an average rating of 3.75 for the month. Let me just check that against November to see if that is less or more. That is less, because last month was an average rating of 3.95, so it's not a bad average rating, so I'm not super upset about it. Now let's go over the books in the order that I read them. So some of these, as I said, were borrowed books, so I don't have physical copies, so as always I'll just do a little graphic to the left or the right to display what they are. So the first book I read, I'd borrowed some Alice Oseman books from a friend. I already have like quite a bunch of them, and then my friend sort of lent me a couple of the ones that I didn't own. So the first one that I read this month, I read mostly because it was the perfect time to read it, and that was This Winter by Alice Oseman, which is kind of a book that takes place in both the Heartstopper and the Solitaire kind of timeline. It's like a prequel to the Solitaire book, which I haven't read yet. I am going to get to that this year. And it's set somewhere between book 4 and 5 of Heartstopper, which obviously worked out quite well because book 5 of Heartstopper came out in December. So it was quite a short book. It was just a novella, really. I was actually away at a convention for a few days, but because I wasn't really well, I wasn't at the convention. I just stayed in the hotel all weekend and just relaxed. So this is one of the books I took with me to read whilst I was there, and I think I read it in one sitting. I can't really say I necessarily really loved it. I rated it like a 3 in the end. I think it's kind of hard often with novellas because they don't often delve deep enough to really get you invested. Obviously, this is different in some ways because you go into this novella generally knowing the characters, already being invested in them. It was quite an easy read. It was short, but it was bittersweet. It wasn't necessarily a happy Christmas book, which I'm okay with. Throughout the story, it goes through 3 different points of view of the 3 siblings in the family. Charlie, who is like one of the main protagonists in Heartstopper, his older sister, I think she's older, she might be younger actually, Tori, and then the littlest sibling, who is quite young. He's maybe about like 7 or 8 or something. And his is just kind of like an offshoot one that they've kind of tacked on at the end, I guess. And it was a nice addition to the Heartstopper kind of solitaire universe, but I wasn't really anything that kind of was going to stick with me that much. I did find it very relatable though. It kind of isn't afraid to delve into the more depressing sides of what Christmas can be like for people, particularly people who struggle with their family, people who have eating disorders, people who just struggle with that kind of time when everyone is kind of forced together and it's not necessarily the kind of attention that you like to have from family members at times. So yeah, it was relatable and I liked it fine. You know, it wasn't amazing. It's probably not one that I'll ever reach for to reread, if I'm being honest, but I'm glad I read it. So it was a nice little way to kind of start the month of December off with like an actual Christmas book. Then I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I think I started this back in November and it was part of like my trying to read the Goodreads fantasy nominations books, and I just hadn't got to this one, but it was one I still really wanted to read because I really thought it was going to be something that I would adore. Like, I know it's kind of inspired by The Princess Bride, and I didn't like this one as much as I was going to, and I'm really sad about it. Like, I feel like I'd heard nothing but everyone adored it. I've heard nothing but great reviews about it. But I think the issue for me is that there's a lot of comedy, and I'm really picky when it comes to comedy. There's not a lot of comedy that really kind of gels with me. So I think that is one of the main reasons why I didn't love it as much as I thought I was going to. I still really liked it. I rated it a high 3, like very close to a 4. Like, I thought the story was good, I thought the cast was decent, I enjoyed all the different characters that kind of made up the whole cast of the ship that they go on for a lot of it, but I just didn't like it as much as I thought I was going to. So it's a shame, but it is what it is, and I'm not going to stop reading Brandon Sanderson. It's just, I really thought this one was going to work for me, and I think maybe more of his other secret projects, like The Sunlit Man and Yumi and the Night Painter, is one that I've been heard a lot about, which I think is probably going to be much more up my alley. I have read some Sanderson before. I've read a couple of his standalone books, and I've read the first in the Mistborn series, which I want to get back to at some point. So I've enjoyed other Sanderson I've read, but this is probably for me the one that just didn't work. The world building was really good. Honestly, the fantasy elements were really fun. I enjoyed the world building. Basically, if you don't know anything about it, Tress of the Emerald Sea is about a girl that kind of lives on this island, and all of like the worlds are kind of like have different coloured oceans, and they're not really water, they're kind of some kind of magical element that does stuff. So the Emerald Sea is very poisonous, I believe. It like kind of grows vegetation and will kill you basically if you kind of get any of it into your system. So it was a really cool world building. I liked the premise. I didn't love Tress, I'll be honest, but once she got, I found like I was a bit like not super interested, and then she got on the boat and then I got a lot more interested, and I really liked all the different characters that we met on the boat. It really just reminded me of like a fun D&D adventure. I definitely would recommend it to a lot of people, because I think for a lot of people that maybe want something that bridges that gap between like a fun fairy tale and like a more epic fantasy. But yeah, it just unfortunately is one of those books that in theory I normally would have loved it, but it just didn't click with me. So it's a shame, but yeah, not one that I super loved this month. Then I had my first DNF of the month, and unfortunately it was one of the books that was in my 12 and 12 recommendations. I really did not want to DNF any of these, but I was just really struggling with this one. It was Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. Honestly, for me, it was not the writing. I found like the mystery going into it was quite interesting, and I was sort of interested in where it was going, but some of the themes just really didn't sit right with me. I don't say this about a lot of books, but it felt to me very much like a man book. Like, all of the women were just very two-dimensional. They were sexualized constantly mostly by the teenage main protagonist, which I get because he's a teenager, but also I just didn't like how it was done. There's two main characters basically. There's a teenage boy who runs away, who's called Kafka, and then there's an older man who can speak to cats. His story was quite interesting, but with the teenage boy, there was a lot of him like fantasizing about all the women he was meeting, and then there's kind of like this whole Oedipus thing going on where he's also sort of imagining them as being his mother or his sister at the same time as he's fantasizing, and it just really kind of icked me out. So it wasn't anything to do with the writing, and the mystery was interesting, and I know it gets very weird, but honestly in the end, like I was just getting bad vibes from it, to the point where I ended up looking online for some spoilers of what is going to come into the plot, because I was just getting the heebie-jeebies. And what I read about where the plot goes really did kind of confirm for me this is not a book that was for me. Unfortunately, it went into areas I'm not keen on. I'm not going to spoiler it, because if you're interested you can look yourself, and I am aware this is a very popular book that is very well liked and well loved, and I completely understand that. But for me, I wasn't keen on the direction the story arc was taking, and there are some instances of animal cruelty that I was just not down for, honestly. So I think that, you know, overall the plot summary does go in a really interesting direction. I think the writing can be very beautiful and lyrical and poetic a lot of the time. There's a lot of philosophizing, but it just didn't work for me, and I wasn't going to make myself sit through what was quite a long book, really. It's got to be about 100 pages or so. Editing Kylie will correct me exactly how long it is. I didn't want to sit through a book that was that long and just be kind of dreading what was going to happen for the sake of a few sprinklings of really good writing and ideas. So I just decided to stop it, and I DNF'd that book, and I have no regrets, honestly. From what I've heard as well, Haruki Murakami's work, I've wanted to check his stuff out for a while, but he does have a tendency to not write women well, and that isn't always an issue for me, but I just really didn't like how he wrote them in this book. And if he kind of is like that for all his books, like quite misogynistic in the way he writes women, then I'm probably not going to check any more books out by him. So that was my first DNF of the month. I then decided I wanted to read something that was a little bit lighter, so I picked up a contemporary, which turned out to not be light at all. So I picked up I Was Born for This by Alice Oseman. That was another one that had been borrowed by a friend of mine. I did enjoy this a lot more, thankfully, than Kafka and the Shore. I enjoyed it more than this winter, actually. I gave it a high 3, almost a 4, I think. And the thing with this is that I really enjoyed a lot of the discussions it was having, and then it just kind of lost me towards the end. So the book is essentially about this young Muslim teenage girl, and she has gone to London, I believe, for the first time. Her family aren't happy about it because she was supposed to be having like a big graduation. They see her as like running away from her life to go to this gig with a friend of hers that she met online for like her favourite band that her and her friend are completely obsessed with. And she gets there and it just doesn't turn out to be exactly what she thought it was going to be. Things with her friend are not quite working out. And then leading up to the big concert she's going to, things are just kind of unraveling. And then we're also seeing things from the viewpoint of the lead singer of the band, Jimmy, who is a trans boy, and things in his life are not going well. Like, he is mentally deteriorating like horrendously. And it's all to do with kind of like the pressure that he is feeling from what the band is being forced to do now. They're really popular. The fear he has of these people who idolize him so much. And it was really interesting sort of like analysis and critique of things like fandom and parasocial relationships. And it wasn't afraid to go dark. Like, I really thought it was going to kind of go in this route where it was going to be like, oh, they'll meet each other and Jimmy will be like, she's great, my fans are fine. And that was not what happened. Again, I'm not going to spoil it, but I really appreciated how realistic it was with everything that was happening between the two of them. I don't think the main girl is like a super likable protagonist, but I think she's very well written, and I liked her for that, and I could very much kind of like see where she was coming from a lot of the time. So I enjoyed it up until about the halfway point. I was just enjoying all of it from like almost more of an intellectual standpoint, I suppose, rather than it being enjoyable. But then it got to the halfway point, and that's when it took a turn, and I did not like where it went. Basically, some stuff happens, and Jimmy and Angel, who is the girl, end up going off on this kind of like this trip together, and it got very convoluted, and I just didn't think it made sense with what happened. Like, it goes for this like very dramatic sort of conclusion, which felt like it was just there to kind of pull things together in a way without necessarily really dealing with the main issues at hand. It was such a realistic book, and then I think like this last part of it just devolved into this like kind of ridiculous soap opera kind of thing that I didn't like. Like there was a whole like near-death experience that happened to someone, and of course because that happened it was like everyone's problems were solved. I mean, of course everyone's problems weren't solved, but the way it was kind of written, it was almost like nothing really got resolved in a way. Like the whole thing with like Jimmy having these really bad panic attacks and stuff, it just kind of felt like it got swept under the rug and they were like, it'll be fine, we'll work it out. And I just didn't think that really stayed true to the spirit of so much of the first half of the book was all about the anxiety and the mental health of both of these two characters. I thought Angel's storyline developed and closed off in a more conclusive and satisfying manner, but even with that I wasn't really totally like sold on what happened with her. I just kind of wanted more, and I wanted more of a satisfying conclusion about where the two of them were mentally, rather than it just being kind of like this big thing happens and everything is kind of forgotten. It's a shame because I was really enjoying that book up to that point. Like it was on track to be like a mid to high 4, maybe even a 5. I was enjoying it that much. I just felt like the plot just kind of derailed towards the end, unfortunately. A lot of people said that they really loved the book's conclusion a lot from what I've seen online, but honestly for me, like I finished the book and I just felt sad rather than like happy about how things had turned out. So like I said, it was an interesting book, definitely one I really liked overall. Like it had such interesting things it had to say, but the ending just completely lost me, unfortunately. So I've had a bit of a trend of this happening recently. I've seen where I'm like really enjoying a book and then the ending kind of comes in and I'm like, oh no, this is not where I thought you were going and I don't like the new direction it's going in, so never mind. Next, after all of the really disappointing books, I suppose, like not disappointing, but like I said, I wanted something that I knew I would have a solid good time with, so I picked up a graphic novel, and thankfully I'm very happy to say that this one was exactly what I needed. It was Magical Boy Volume 1 by, I'm not going to be able to pronounce their name, but I think it's Tae Kao. So it is about a young teenage boy who is trans, who isn't really out yet to anybody in his family. He's only really out to like one of his friends, and he's not out to anybody else. And then he finds out very suddenly that he is descended from a line of magical girls, basically like come into their powers in their teenage years and have to fight against evil to stop like this great dark power kind of coming back and destroying the world. So he's just trying to like come into himself. He's trying to discover his identity, discover how he feels, trying to come out to his family, which is very, very complicated. And then he basically finds out that he's got this like hugely feminine like identity which is imposed on him as he starts to kind of get these powers, and he like it gives him like a magical girl transformation, which he hates because it's obviously putting him inside something which is incredibly feminine. But it was a really good book. It wasn't anything that I think was like majorly complex. I think it's definitely kind of like a YA, almost middle grade-y maybe kind of audience, but I really enjoyed what it did. It was very fun. The art was really nice, and it was nice to see how things sort of changed for the character throughout the book. And it was very much about them also realising and accepting their own identity, not just trying to make everyone else believe in their identity. So yeah, it was really good. I definitely want to check out volume 2. I believe it is only 2 volumes, and I think that's honestly fine. Like it feels like it's just a nice little compact story which had some really lovely things to say. It had some lovely art, and it was just a really good time basically. So that was my breather book, and then unfortunately I had a not so great book again, and this was also a 12 and 12 recommendation, but I did finish this one. And I didn't hate it, honestly, this one. So this was a mystery book called The Club Dumas, also known as the Dumas Club, depending on which translation variant you get, I think. It is originally a French book, I believe, by Arturo Perez Reverte, who's written basically a whole load of like mystery stuff. And I didn't realise when I was recommended this that it was actually later turned into a film called Ninth Gate, starring Johnny Depp. I've never seen the film before, but as soon as I realised that they were kind of like, it was kind of inspired by this book, I was like, well, I'm going to have to watch the film now after I read it. So, onto the book itself. I ended up rating it as sort of like a low to mid 3. Basically, it's a literary mystery about this book dealer called Lucas Corso, who gets hired to kind of authenticate this manuscript, which is supposed to be one of the original chapters from Alexandre Dumas' The Three Musketeers book. And as he does so, he also gets involved in this other book as well, this manuscript that has also kind of fallen into his hands, which is to do with like raising the devil or something. So the mystery I really enjoyed. Like anything literary I'm gonna love, and you know, I love a book about books. It gave me big Da Vinci Code vibes, honestly. I thought the writing was very good, but as with kind of some of the other books I found this month, I think the ending was very dissatisfying, and I felt very mixed about how the characters were portrayed. So for a lot of it, I didn't again like the portrayal of how women were in the book. There was just a lot of like unnecessary kind of sexual stuff that I didn't want. Although part of me does think that with the way it was written, it was kind of done in an ironic manner rather than necessarily being sort of misogynistic, because our main character as well, he was often described in a way that was kind of painting him as being kind of silly at times, and all the different characters in it are kind of given these character archetypes from the novel of The Three Musketeers, and Lucas himself basically kind of gives them these roles and even calls them by that name. In particular, he says, oh, one character is the Baroness, and this other character who's kind of like this main villain from The Three Musketeers, who I think he does eventually find out the guy's name, but for the whole thing, he's just calling him by this, like, villain's name. So he's kind of giving everyone these, like, character names, and I thought that was really interesting. So in part, I do think that the way that the women were portrayed in the book was to fit in with that whole, we're painting them with two-dimensional things, and then we're going to pull the veil back and show who they really are. I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that was kind of done on purpose by the author, I assume. I've said before that I'm not always a big fan of like mystery and thriller books, but I actually really did enjoy the mystery in this one. Like, this is kind of one of the mysteries I guess I do enjoy. I was never really super keen on Corso, to be honest, as kind of like our hero detective kind of character, but I enjoyed a lot of the side characters. I thought the Baroness and these like two twins who are book forgers were particularly standouts, and yeah, I genuinely like kind of enjoyed the intrigue this book had and trying to sort of figure it out and work out what was going on, because it wasn't just like one mystery, it was kind of two mysteries that were sort of interweaving, because we had what was going on with the Dumas manuscript as well as with the like satanic manuscript as well, and it was interesting to see how that kind of played out, but I didn't really enjoy the end kind of reveals, unfortunately. So it was just kind of okay. It definitely wasn't a book that I say I regret reading, and it's still a book that I think, you know, I'm not a big mystery fan. I enjoyed it well enough for what it was. So then I watched the film Ninth Gate, and my gosh, it was not good. So, like, the book is mostly more concerned, I think, with the Dumas stuff than it is with the satanic script, and the film just decides to throw the Dumas stuff completely out and just focus on, like, the Satan stuff, which I get because it's probably the more interesting storyline, but I don't think it was done well, and it was just very silly and very camp. It felt a lot of the time like with this whole thing with like these cultists and stuff, and I just couldn't take it seriously. And yeah, basically, like, I enjoyed in the book where there was a lot of time where there was especially this one discussion between a whole bunch of students and academics, and they're talking all about Dumas's books and how his characters are and that kind of thing. I really enjoyed that kind of discussion. All of that was just lost in the movie, essentially. It was pretty boring, to be honest. The movie basically removed everything that I actually liked about the book. Like, for example, like in the book, like, even though like Corso is kind of made fun of a lot, like he is quite intelligent, and he does manage to like pull the pieces together. He manages to come to a lot of the conclusions and figure a lot of stuff out himself, so you know as the reader that he's capable. You do not get this in the movie. Like, basically everyone just tells him what's happening. He gets himself into all these stupid situations, and he's just really seen as like being this idiot essentially is how it's played. And like, even though it's Johnny Depp, like, he could not save this movie. So it really wasn't good. So some of like the other side characters who were in the novel were still kind of well done in the movie, but overall I thought it was just really camp, really overdramatic, and just silly, and not in a good way silly. So yeah, wouldn't recommend the movie tomorrow, to be honest. Also, I realised for the whole of that, I could have just been holding up a copy of the book, because I do still have the copy from the library before I take it back, but I completely forgot. So yeah. Oh, one thing I will mention though, it does have this really interesting thing, which is kind of how you're trying to figure out the mystery, where it's got these like picture engravings throughout. Because basically there's like these 3 different manuscripts and they've all kind of got slight differences within the pictures. So it's kind of like you're playing spot the difference to try and work out which pictures are different. And they're all kind of very like tarot, I suppose, in meaning. So you kind of got like the Hanged Man and that kind of thing. So I really liked that element of it. Again, Da Vinci Code vibes. Yeah, it definitely wasn't the worst book. I enjoyed it well enough for what it was. Again, I thought the ending was a little bit dissatisfying. I really wish it had been a better resolution with the way the manuscripts were kind of, with what the deal was with them was kind of resolved. I wish they'd kind of been better meshed together, I suppose, in terms of the 2 subplots. It wasn't bad. I would maybe read from this author again, depending on what the story was, but definitely not the worst book. And I think I'm discovering that this is the kind of mystery I do like. So yeah, win for that, I guess. After that, did say I was reading Alice Oseman books for a reason. I picked up volume 5 of Heartstopper by Alice Oseman. I actually picked this up from Queer Lit, and it's got this like really cute little like bookmark that they brought with it, and they actually had a really nice little display. I think you probably would have seen it in like my book haul video where I picked up this book. So yeah, obviously I've already read the first 4 volumes. I love this series. I had to pick up volume 5. I read it basically the next day after I got it, and I really loved it. This was my 5-star of the month. I'm not going to go into massive detail about the story, because obviously it is the 5th in a series. It's a sequel. It's just going to be spoilers, but I really enjoyed what happened in this book. I really love the relationship between these 2. I love how realistic a lot of the things are, and a lot of the representation that we see in this book, both not just gay but bisexual, asexuality, that kind of thing. And there was a lot more of that in this book. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. Not much more I can say about that, but it was a really good, and I'm happy to have read it. After that, I read an arc. So this is Ashes to Ashes by Stacey Willis. She's had a couple of books out previously, which I haven't read any of her other books before, but she primarily writes kind of dark fantasy. And this is an LGBT dark fantasy book, basically about this non-binary person called Alexander, who gets kind of embroiled in this curse that's in this like small town, and everyone in this town is cursed, and this strange boy who he believes he has memories of, and who has something to do with an upcoming apocalypse, is all I'll say, because I don't really want to spoil it. So I was very kindly gifted an arc by Stacey Willis of this book, my first arc ever, so that was really nice to have that experience. And yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I rated it a 4-star. I don't know if it's because it's like a proof edition. There were still a couple of issues with some of the grammar here and there in places, but overall I really enjoyed it. I've never read her before, but I think she has a really gorgeous writing style, perhaps a little overwritten at times, but a lot of the writing that she wrote was beautiful, lyrical. I really enjoyed reading it. Like, it's one of the few times I think I could have easily just kind of like been annotating it as I went, just to like mark out some of these absolutely gorgeous quotes that were coming from it. I really appreciated the non-binary representation with Alexander. I thought it was really well done. I liked how it didn't necessarily overwhelm the whole of the story, and I really did think it was incredibly relatable. As someone who is also non-binary, I definitely sort of I related a lot to what Alexander was going through, again, as somebody whose family did not understand. They lived in this town that they came to once they were younger, and they were horrendously bullied and basically suffered trauma from that point. I've had therapy to try and get over it, and they'd be basically forced to return after a family tragedy. So a lot of it was about them trying to deal with returning to this place that holds a lot of trauma for them, and then obviously the place itself was really messed up. So yeah, I really enjoyed Alexandra as one of the protagonists, and I really enjoyed the other protagonist as well, who is our mystery boy, Shane, and I really liked their interactions together. Like, I enjoyed like the banter they kind of had between them and the romance. Even just individual characters, I just enjoyed them a lot as well. I enjoyed our third character a lot too. I thought she was quite interesting. I didn't think she was necessarily someone who would have seen a point of view from, and I really appreciated seeing her as kind of like the outsider to this romantic relationship that's happening. Like, I did think, like, for me, because I'm not majorly into romance, like the romance got a little bit over much after a while for me, but I think for people who are into romance, like, they would have loved that. I really enjoyed the book plot-wise as well. I think the last little bit, unfortunately, did go a little bit, like, it got a little bit too fast with the events that were happening, and I found it a little bit confusing to keep up. Probably something that I would need to have a reread on just to kind of get that embedded in my brain. Like, it felt like a lot of this book was like a slow burn leading up to something happening, and then everything happened all at once. And I did like how it was a slow burn for a lot of it, and how even though there were all these, there was like the supernatural stuff was kind of coming in, but it was quite subtle the way it was done. It was very much more focused on them investigating what was happening and them talking and learning about each other. The ending as well, I found it to be very bittersweet, kind of sad, and I actually really liked that. Like, I liked it wasn't a traditional happy ending. I wish there had been like a bit more closure perhaps with some of the things that had happened, mostly with what would happen back with old people in the village, and our third character. But I overall, I really enjoyed it. I really love the writing. I'll probably will check out more stuff by Stacey Willis because I thought this was really good. It is currently now out. I believe the paperback isn't out yet. I've got a little graphic that I can show for the paperback that is coming out. So I believe that's going to be coming out in February or March. But the PDF, the ebook version of this, is out now. So if you're interested in like a dark LGBT fantasy, then I would highly recommend it. Honestly, I had a good time with it. Then I read, my intention was to read a whole like bunch of Christmas books. I'd obviously already read this winter, but my one thing I really wanted to do was to read A Christmas Carol on Christmas Eve. So that is indeed what I did. This was a reread for me. I used to have a copy of this when I was younger, and I really liked it. And yeah, I just kind of have been wanting to reread this for Christmas for a while. I meant to do it last year. I didn't get round to it because I was too busy reading Nettle and Bone instead. But I finally prioritised it, and yeah, there's not really much to say. It is, you know, the perfect Christmas fairy tale ghost story, and yeah, I know it really well. It's just a good time. I'd also watched the Muppet Christmas Carol movie just a few days beforehand, so it was quite funny having watched that, then reading the similarities again between the two, and yeah, just the perfect kind of Christmas book really for me. So it was good. I don't even know what to rate it. It's probably a 4-star for me. So yeah, that was my Christmas Eve read. I then read my other Christmas book, which was Midnight in Everwood by M.A. Kuznia. And this is kind of like a Nutcracker retelling. I'm vaguely familiar with the Nutcracker story, mostly through the ballets, I think, but I'm not super up on it, so I kind of went into this one a bit more blind. But essentially it is about a girl called Marietta who is a ballerina, and she really wants to be a ballerina full time and kind of go to school for it, but she's from this kind of noble family that don't see it as like a good profession, and all they really want from her, because by the way this is set in the 1900s in Nottingham, which I thought was really fun because I spent a lot of time in Nottingham. I did my secondary school and university there, so it was fun when I got to see little like things about Nottingham in that. Basically, she's from a noble family, so all they want her to do is find a wealthy man and marry him and be like a housekeeper essentially for him, and that is not at all what she wants. She ends up meeting this like strange man who like lives next door called Drosselmeyer, and he kind of gets interested in her in like a creepy way, and things happen. and she ends up being transported to this kind of magical, fantastical world called Everwood. And whilst there, like, she finds it's a place that she can dance, and she thinks it's all amazing, and until she realizes it's really not that amazing at all. And there is some darkness underneath all the sweetness that she is seeing around. And yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it a solid 4-star. It unfortunately was one again where the ending kind of dropped off a little bit for me, but I was generally happy with the final resolution of the events. I really like what happened to Marietta and the completion of her character arc. I thought it was just perfect for her. I like, around the middle part, like, I kind of lost interest a little bit when things were kind of like, they got a bit slow and there was a bit of focus on like Marietta and like this romantic relationship she was building up with somebody. But I liked her story arc a lot, and one of the side characters, Delara, was easily my favourite character in the book. She was brilliant. So yeah, I thought it was a really cute book. It's great if you want like a Christmassy, wintry sort of read. It just didn't necessarily hold up for me in the last half, but otherwise I really enjoyed this. I'd recommend it. It is just like a cute fairy tale that has some really good things to say, and also there are so much descriptions of like sweets and food and desserts and stuff, so if you like that kind of thing, this is definitely the book for you. So the next 3 books that I read were kind of books that I hadn't necessarily planned to read this month. I had taken a bunch of books with me, so I was away for a good week in Norwich for a family wedding and to celebrate Christmas, so I took some books with me, and I was staying in Airbnb, and I just had this idea of like reading the books that have been left in the Airbnb, so I ended up kind of doing that rather than reading the books I brought with me. So I've done a little vlog of that, which you'll probably see come up at some point in January, of the books that I read, so I'm not really going to go very in depth into the books themselves here because I've got a whole vlog for it coming. But basically I read this like family drama mystery called The Bay at Midnight by Diane Chamberlain. Was definitely not the sort of book I would ever have picked up, and I actually really enjoyed it. I was super invested in it, and yeah, I liked it a lot, shockingly. I don't think I'd check the author out again, but I got weirdly invested, and yeah, it was decent. It was a 3.5. I then read some of an anthology, but did eventually DNF it. So I read a few stories from The Dream Lover by William Boyd. They're kind of like literary short stories, I suppose, and I didn't really have time to sort of finish that, so I read a couple, kind of knew what I felt about it as a whole, and then I didn't finish it. So you're not going to get a rating for that one. And then I also, whilst I was visiting my cousin, and there was some downtime at her house, and she has a lot of books, so I ended up just picking something at random to read whilst like some other things were going on, and I ended up reading Brokeback Mountain by Annie Proulx, I believe her name is. So obviously most people will know this from the movie. I actually didn't realise that the book originally is quite a short novella sort of book, so I managed to finish it all in one sitting. Basically it's like 50 pages, and it was good. Yeah, I liked it. I thought it had some really nice writing, and it was okay. Yeah, I have nothing really to yell about it, honestly. I appreciated the story that it told. I thought the writing was good, but honestly it falls into that subgenre of LGBT books that are just kind of depressing, and I don't really enjoy that kind of thing. Like, I love me some LGBT stuff, but I much prefer when it's like joy rather than sadness and death, and that's kind of what this book was, which I did know going into it. I just kind of was intrigued to see it because it's obviously so kind of well known. So yeah, it was fine. I rated it a low 3, I think, so it wasn't bad. I enjoyed it whilst I was reading it, but not one I'll pick up again, unfortunately, because it's just too sad for me, basically. For anyone that doesn't know, it is about these 2 ranchers in America back in, I think it's like the 50s or something, and they end up developing this like relationship that they don't initially understand, and it is that time, unfortunately, where it is not accepted, and it's about them kind of struggling through life, realizing that they still have this bond to each other. So yeah, it was very realistic, it was interesting, but ultimately just a little bit too sad for me to enjoy it. And then we're finally on my last book that I read, and I'll be honest, I picked up something short and I deliberately just chose to read it because I was annoyingly at like not a round number for my like books read in 2023, and I was like one off being from a round number, so I was like, no, I'm just gonna read something short so I can finish it. I still had like 2 to 3 days left at this time, and I still had a whole train journey to go back from. So I initially did pick up a short YA horror that I was quite interested in, but then I wasn't really in the mood on the way back. So instead, I ended up reading The Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. She's a 19th century poet, and I didn't know anything about her other poem, but I've always wanted to read The Goblin Market because I've always just thought it sounded so interesting. And I'm not really a big poetry fan, I'll admit. Like, it's the kind of thing I was forced to read in school, and I've never really clicked with it that much. But every so often there'll be kind of things that I do like, and I really liked The Goblin Market. I didn't love all the other poems that were in this collection. It's just a very short book that has maybe about 10 other poems in here, aside from The Goblin Market, which takes up most of the book. But I think they're very easy to read. They're all kind of about, they're all quite dark, a lot of them. Like, they're all kind of like about love and loss and magic and mystery and stuff, which is obviously my kind of thing. So even though I didn't love all the other poems, I really loved The Goblin Market, and there was a couple of others in here that really stood out for me. Just have a look to see which ones I liked. Dreamland was good. Queen of Hearts I liked. Sweet Death. I think I liked the first batch of ones in here more than I liked the latter half. But it was a nice quick read, and I was kind of in the mood for something like that, and I like the way that the poetry goes. Like, it's very sort of, it just flows very nicely. So yeah, this was a high 3 for me. I'm not really much of a poetry rater because I don't read it, but I enjoyed it well enough. I would reread it. So that's more than I can say for most poetry. So yeah, that is it for me in my December wrap-up. It was a bit of a mixed bag of a month. December always kind of feels a bit of a mixed bag of a month, so you know, it is what it is. So yeah, I read some good things, I had some disappointing books, I read some things I wasn't expecting to read, but yeah, it was an interesting end to the month. I maybe didn't like clear as many things off my TBR as I wanted to. I was hoping to get through a lot of like library books, and I didn't, but I just wasn't in the mood for it really. So yeah, that's my December wrap up. Let me know if you read anything really good in December. If you have any thoughts about any of the books I read, maybe there's some that like I really didn't like that you loved, so feel free to try and change my mind in the comments, I guess. And until next time, stay safe, stay cozy, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!